The thing nobody tells you about the desert, and I mean the real desert, not the kind you see in movies with clean golden dunes and dramatic sunsets, is that it breathes. Not metaphorically, I mean it literally shifts and moves and hisses around you like something alive. The sand gets into your teeth, into the seams of your rifle, into the corners of your eyes even when they're behind ballistic lenses, and the heat doesn't feel like warmth, it feels like pressure, like the atmosphere itself is sitting on your chest. That morning, and I still call it morning even though the sun had already turned everything white by 7:30, the patrol had been moving for just under 3 hours. 8 men, all SEALs, all veterans of multiple deployments. The kind of unit where nobody really needed to speak much because everyone already knew what the other guy was thinking before he thought it. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Doyle was on point. He'd been on point since Kandahar in 2012, since Mosul in 2016, since about 14 operations in between that don't have names you'd ever read in a newspaper. Marcus was the kind of soldier who moved through hostile terrain the way some people move through a crowded room, with a quiet, almost lazy confidence that somehow never got him killed when everyone expected it would. Behind him was Torres, Miguel Torres from somewhere outside San Antonio, who talked too much during downtime and said almost nothing during missions. Then Wick, real name Wikowski, nobody ever used the full name, who carried the communications rig and had a habit of chewing on the end of a plastic stylus even when he was tense, especially when he was tense. The rest of the team spread behind them at 5-meter intervals, fanning slightly at the edges of a dry riverbed that carved through the basin like an old wound. The mission was, on paper, a reconnaissance sweep. A weapons cache had reportedly been moved through this corridor 3 days earlier. Satellite imaging had picked up vehicle tracks leading into a cluster of abandoned structures about 4 kilometers northeast. The team's job was simple: get eyes on the structures, confirm or deny activity, call it in, extract. Simple, that word gets soldiers killed more reliably than any weapon ever invented. They'd been briefed the night before in a forward operating base that smelled like diesel and instant coffee, and the particular kind of exhaustion that soaks into a building when everyone inside it has been awake too long. The intelligence officer, a young woman named Prentice who looked about 25 but carried herself like someone who'd seen 30 years of bad news, had walked them through the imagery with a laser pointer and a voice that stayed completely flat the entire time. No confirmed hostile presence in sector, she'd said, but the tracks are fresh. Whoever moved through here did it quietly and they knew the terrain. Marcus had asked her what that meant, knowing the terrain. She'd hesitated just for a second. It means they're not visitors. That single pause, that 1/2 second where she'd stopped before answering, I've thought about it 100 times since, because Prentice didn't hesitate about things. She was the kind of analyst who delivered bad news the way a surgeon explains a diagnosis, clearly, quickly, without softening it. When she hesitated, it was because she was deciding how much to say. She didn't say more, and nobody pushed her. They should have pushed her. By 900, the riverbed had narrowed, and the walls on either side had climbed to about 4 meters, jagged, crumbling sandstone the color of old bone. The team moved in near silence. Boots on dry earth make their own kind of sound, a soft rhythmic compression that you stop noticing after a while, but that stays constant, like a metronome underneath everything. Marcus raised a fist. Everyone stopped. He didn't move for about 6 seconds, just stood there with his fist up, head slightly tilted, the way someone looks when they're trying to hear something in a noisy room. Then he turned slowly and looked back down the line and made a small gesture, 2 fingers pointing at his eyes, then pointing left toward the eastern wall of the riverbed. Wick looked left. I looked left. Nothing, just rock, just the shimmering suggestion of heat rising off stone that had been baking since before any of us were born. Marcus lowered his fist slowly and started moving again, but his pace had changed. It was almost imperceptible, maybe half a step slower, the weight shifting forward slightly rather than rolling heel to toe. The posture of a man who's heard something he can't identify yet but has decided not to pretend he didn't hear it. Torres later said he noticed it too, that shift in Marcus's walk. He said it was like watching a dog's ears go flat, the signal before the signal. None of us said anything. You don't break silence for a feeling. You file it away and keep moving and hope the feeling was wrong. That morning, the feeling was not wrong. The abandoned structures appeared at 9:23, exactly where the satellite imagery had placed them. 3 buildings, if you could call them that. They looked like they'd been built fast and abandoned faster. Breeze block walls, no roofs on 2 of them, the third one partially collapsed on its southern side. The kind of architecture that exists in exactly one context and everyone who sees it knows what that context is. The team spread into a loose perimeter about 80 meters out. Standard procedure: observe before you approach, give the location time to reveal itself. Marcus lay in the prone position at the head of the approach and glassed the buildings through his scope for almost 4 minutes without moving. Later, when we talked about it, weeks later, back stateside, over drinks that nobody really wanted but everyone needed, he said the thing that bothered him wasn't what he saw. It was what he didn't see. No birds, he said. You know how there's always something, even in the worst places, there's always some kind of bird, some kind of insect noise, something alive making noise. There was nothing, complete dead quiet except for the wind. He said it the way you say something that still bothers you even though you know you can't explain why it should. The desert went quiet before it happened, he said, like it knew. At 9:31, the order was given to approach. 2 men, Tors and a SEAL named Garrett, broke from the perimeter and moved in a fast, low run toward the nearest structure. The rest of the team covered. They reached the wall, stacked, moved around the corner. Tors' voice came through the comms, low and even. First structure clear, evidence of recent occupation, fire pit, cold, 3 to 4 days old minimum, moving to second. Marcus acknowledged. The rest of the team began compressing the perimeter slightly, moving up behind cover. And that's when it happened. Not an explosion, not the crack of a firefight opening up from multiple directions, not the chaos you rehearse for and expect. A single shot. One round, supersonic. The sound of it, that sharp, violent snap that's different from a gunshot heard at a distance, that's the sound of the round passing close, came from the east, above them, from somewhere on the ridge that ran parallel to the approach corridor. Garrett went down. Not dead, not yet, not from that round, but down, hard, his rifle skidding in the dirt and his body folding in a way that made your stomach drop even from 80 meters away. Tors dragged him behind the wall. And then silence again, like the shot had never happened. Like the desert had simply exhaled once and gone back to sleep. Shooter East Ridge, single round, identify. Marcus's voice on the comms was flat, controlled, the voice of a man running a procedure, not a man who just watched a teammate get hit. Nobody answered that call with a location, because nobody had one. That was the first moment the real weight of it landed. Because in a unit like that, at that level of training, there is always someone who has eyes on the elevated terrain. Always. That's not an oversight, that's doctrine. You do not advance on a structure without overwatch on the high ground. They had overwatch? Reyes was on the western ridge with a long rifle and a full field of view across the approach. He'd been there since 8:45. He had eyes on everything. Reyes, confirm East Ridge. Do you have the shooter? Marcus again. A pause that felt much longer than it was. Negative, nothing on the East Ridge. I have 0 movement, 0 profile. I don't have a shooter. Marcus didn't say anything for a moment. Garrett had taken the round through the upper shoulder. It had passed through cleanly, which was luck of the brutal mechanical kind, and Tors was managing the wound with the kind of focused efficiency that combat medicine produces. His hands moving without hesitation, while the rest of his mind stayed alert to the perimeter. But the question was sitting on top of everything else. 1 round from the East Ridge, and Reyes, who was looking directly at the East Ridge, had seen nothing. Not a muzzle flash, not a dust signature, not a figure, not a profile, not a shadow. Nothing. Where's the shooter? Wick said it out loud, not into the comms, just said it quietly, almost to himself. The stylus he always chewed on was in his hand, perfectly still. It was the question none of them could answer. And the desert, as it had been doing all morning, offered nothing back but silence and heat and the faint, directionless sound of wind moving over stone. There's a specific kind of fear that doesn't announce itself the way most fear does. It doesn't come with a racing heart and shaking hands. It doesn't make you want to run. It comes quietly and settles somewhere between your shoulder blades, and it stays there, cold and completely still, and what it tells you is this: something is wrong in a way you don't have a category for yet. That's what the next 20 minutes felt like. Garrett was stable. Tors had packed the wound and gotten a tourniquet above it, and Garrett was conscious and furious in the way that injured men sometimes get. The anger is partly pain and partly the insult of it, the indignity of being the one who went down. He kept trying to get up and Tors kept telling him to stop, and eventually Tors told him something short and specific that made Garrett stop arguing. Nobody asked what it was. You learn not to ask. The team had consolidated into the first structure. Marcus had everyone off the open ground within 90 seconds of the shot. The building provided 3 solid walls, and the collapsed southern face gave 2 men good angles on the approach without full exposure. It wasn't a perfect position, but nothing out there was perfect. The east ridge was maybe 220 meters away. Medium elevation, not dramatic, not the kind of height that makes a sniper's job easy, but enough. The ridgeline was irregular, broken into a series of sharp horizontal formations that jutted out like teeth. The kind of ground that swallows a man completely if the man knows what he's doing. Rays had come down off the western ridge and repositioned, moving wide and fast to get a better angle on the east face. It took him 11 minutes. When he finally reported back, his voice had something in it that was hard to name. I've been over every centimeter of this ridgeline. I've got nothing. No person, no hide, no brass, no sign of recent movement. Marcus said, is it possible they moved out between the shot and you repositioning? Rays was quiet for a moment. I was on the ridge inside 3 minutes of the shot. To clear the ridge in 3 minutes from any firing position on that face you'd need, he stopped. I don't know what you'd need, I just know it's not there. Here's what they knew. 1 round had been fired from a direction. They had a direction because of the wound. The entry angle on Garrett's shoulder told a story about trajectory that the team's medic, a man named Kowalski who'd done 3 combat tours before cross-training to medicine, read the way a mechanic reads an engine. The round had come from elevation from the east, at an angle consistent with a firing position somewhere in the upper third of that ridge. That was the science of it, clean, readable. The problem was everything else. No shooter, no hide, no brass, no movement before, during, or after. Rays was one of the best long-range riflemen in the unit, and his ability to read ground, to look at terrain and understand where a human body could and couldn't exist within it, was the kind of skill that took years to develop and couldn't be faked. If Rays said the ridge was empty, the ridge was empty. And yet, Wick had pulled up the topographic overlay on his tablet and was studying it with the kind of focus that excludes everything else. He traced the ridge with 1 finger slowly from south to north, stopping at each of the major formations. Marcus watched him and didn't interrupt. There, Wicks had finally and pointed. There was a formation about 40 meters from the northern end of the ridge, a place where 2 of the horizontal rock layers had separated and left a gap maybe 60 centimeters wide and 2 meters long. On the topo map it looked like nothing, a crack in the rock. On the satellite imagery, which was 12 hours old, the freshest they had, it looked like shadow. A cleft, Wick said. You could get a man in there prone, face down, full concealment. The natural shadow from the overhang above would kill any thermal signature if they had the right insulation under them. Marcus looked at it for a long moment. Ray's north end of the ridge, there's a cleft formation, 40 meters from the northern tip. Can you put eyes on it? Ray's shifted, took about 90 seconds. I can see the formation, I can see into it partially. I'm not seeing anything but rock and shadow. Partially, Marcus said. There's about a 60 centimeter section I can't fully penetrate from this angle. The overhang cuts my line. Marcus looked at Tors. Tors looked back at him. Nobody said anything because the thing that needed to be said was obvious and nobody wanted to be the one to say it out loud, which is that they had a wounded man, a position with 3 walls, and a potential shooter who might or might not still be in a crack in a ridge 200 meters away, and the correct next move was far from obvious. What happened next I've heard described differently by different people who were there, and I think that's because the next part happened fast and in fragments and each person was watching a different piece of it. What I know for certain, Marcus decided to move, not to extract, not yet, not with the approach corridor potentially still under observation, but to flank, to get someone around the northern end of the ridge and come at that cleft formation from the back. He took Wick and a SEAL named Domings and they went wide, very wide, looping north through a shallow depression that ran parallel to the ridgeline and gave them cover from the approach. It took almost 20 minutes to cover the ground without exposing themselves. During those 20 minutes, the rest of the team held position. Garrett had gone quiet, not unconscious, just conserving. Tors sat with his back against the wall and his rifle pointed at the gap in the collapsed southern face. Rays watched the ridge. Kowalski watched everything else. Nobody spoke. The desert does something to silence, it makes it heavier somehow, fills it with something that isn't sound but isn't absence either. The heat maybe, the way the air moves in slow, invisible currents over baked rock, you become very aware of your own breathing. I've been in quiet rooms, I've been in empty buildings at 3 in the morning, nothing sounds like desert silence, it has a texture to it. Marcus came over the comms at 10:43. We're at the back of the formation, coming up on the cleft from the north. A pause, movement sounds the scrape of boots on rock, faint and careful. Then nothing for almost a full minute. Talk to me, Tor said. Another few seconds. When Marcus came back on, his voice was different, not alarmed, not the crisp operational tone he'd been using all morning, something quieter, something that took a second to place. Confused, Marcus Doyle, who had been in more bad situations than most men twice his age, sounded genuinely confused. There's someone here, he said, or there was. They'd found the cleft, and inside the cleft, pressed into the shadowed gap between the rock layers built directly into the stone floor, was a firing position. Undeniably, a shallow depression scraped clean of loose rock just wide enough for a man's shoulders. A narrow channel worn into the stone at the front of the gap, angled at precisely the trajectory Kowalski had calculated from Garrett's wound. A small square of thermal insulating material cut from what looked like an emergency survival blanket, the kind you could buy in any outdoor supply store anywhere in the world, laid flat in the depression. And nothing else. No spent brass, no equipment, no footprints leading away from the back of the formation. The surface behind the cleft was bare rock, unreadable. He was here, Marcus said. He absolutely was here, and then he wasn't. They spent another 40 minutes on that ridge. Wick photographed everything. Domings took measurements. Marcus walked every angle trying to reconstruct the geometry of how a man gets in, fires once, and disappears from a ridge that someone was watching within 3 minutes. There were 3 possible conclusions, and none of them were comfortable. The first, the shooter had moved impossibly fast, had fired and then cleared the ridge in the window between the shot and Ray's repositioning, using a route that left no readable sign on the terrain, which meant someone with extraordinary physical ability and knowledge of that specific ground, so intimate it could only come from extended prior reconnaissance. The second, the shooter was still on the ridge somehow, still concealed, still watching, which was a thought that made every man on that position suddenly very aware of the skin on the back of his neck. The third, and this was the one that Wick brought up on the descent quietly, not as a conclusion but as a question, was that whoever had built that position had built it over a period of time, had prepared it, had studied the approach corridor, the patrol patterns, the timing, had known before the patrol left the fob that morning roughly where they would be and roughly when. This wasn't improvised, Wick said. He said it the way you say something you'd rather not say. Nobody digs a firing position into a ridgeline the morning of a patrol. That takes days, maybe longer. Marcus didn't respond. He was looking back at the ridge from the lower ground, looking at the cleft, which from this angle was invisible, genuinely invisible, a shadow among shadows, completely unreadable as a hiding place unless you already knew it was there. He knew we were coming, Tor said, not a question. He knew someone was coming, Marcus said, whether he knew it was us. He didn't finish the sentence. But the thing that stayed with everyone, the thing that came up again later back at the fob in the debrief and in every conversation about it afterward, wasn't the shot itself. It wasn't even the disappearance. It was the fact that the shot had hit Garrett in the shoulder. One round, from 220 meters. From a prepared position, from a shooter who clearly had the skill and the preparation and the knowledge of the terrain that would have made a kill shot entirely possible. He'd hit the shoulder. You don't miss that by accident, Kowalski said later. He was looking at his hands when he said it, the way people look at something neutral when they're saying something they don't want to look at directly. Not at that range, not with a prepared position. So what does that mean? Someone asked. Kowalski took a long time answering. It means he didn't want to kill anyone today. It means today was something else. The question nobody could answer, not in the debrief, not months later, not now, was what today had been for. What message gets sent by a single non-lethal round from an invisible position? What does a ghost sniper with a prepared hide and a deliberate miss tell you? The desert didn't answer, the ridge didn't answer. And the shooter, whoever he was, wherever he went, gave them nothing. Just the one shot, just the shoulder, just the question. Where's the shooter? And the silence that followed it, which was somehow louder than the round itself. 3 weeks after the patrol, Marcus Doyle was sitting in a folding chair outside his bunk at the fob, drinking coffee that had gone cold without him noticing, when Prentice came and sat down across from him. She didn't say anything immediately. She had a folder in her lap, the kind with no markings on the outside, which in that environment meant more than a folder with markings. She set it on her knee and looked out across the compound for a moment, and Marcus let her because he'd learned by then that Prentice's silences were working silences, not uncomfortable ones. "I found something," she said finally. She opened the folder. There were satellite images inside, different ones from the pre-patrol briefing, these taken post-incident, with a red circle drawn on one of them in marker. The circle was over the East Ridge. "This is 2 hours before your patrol reached the corridor," she said. Marcus leaned forward and looked at it. The image was grainy, the resolution on the dated bird they'd had coverage from that day wasn't exceptional, but inside the red circle, if you looked at it for long enough, there was something. A shape. A dark horizontal line in the upper third of the ridge that was slightly wrong for natural rock shadow. Slightly too regular, slightly too deliberate. "That's him," Marcus said. "That's someone," Prentice said carefully, "in position 2 hours before you arrived." Marcus sat back. He looked at the image for a while longer. You knew something was different before the patrol. It wasn't an accusation. He'd already processed the anger about that, sometime in the middle of the nights that followed the incident when sleep doesn't come and you replay things and then replay them again and then eventually arrive somewhere past anger, in the exhausted country of just wanting to understand. Prentice didn't deny it. "I had an anomaly, movement patterns in the sector that didn't fit insurgent logistics, too disciplined, too patient. Whoever was operating in that corridor was staying off the known routes, moving at times that suggested they understood our collection windows." "You hesitated when I asked what knowing the terrain meant." "I hesitated because I wasn't certain enough to say what I was thinking." "What were you thinking?" She looked at him steadily, "That we weren't the only professionals in that corridor. The investigation, if you could call it that, it was more of a sustained intelligence effort that ran parallel to ongoing operations for the following 2 months, turned up a constellation of details that individually meant very little and together painted something that still didn't have clean edges. The thermal insulation material from the firing position was matched to a specific production batch. That batch had gone to 3 separate procurement channels, 2 of which were trackable, and 1 of which disappeared into the kind of gray market that exists everywhere people are paid to make things not exist. The caliber of the round extracted from Garrett's shoulder was a common one, not useful by itself. But the bullet's characteristics, the specific toolmark signatures, pointed to ammunition that had been manufactured for a particular program that had officially ended in 2014. Officially. There was a man, and I want to be careful about how I describe this because I only know parts of it and the parts I know were never confirmed in writing. A man who had worked in a certain capacity in that region for a long time. Not military, not quite intelligence. The kind of role that exists in the spaces between those two things. The kinds of roles that programs create when they need something done that neither the military nor intelligence is cleanly suited to do. He had a name, but names in that world are temporary things. And the name Prentice eventually connected to the firing position on the ridge was a name that appeared in documents dating back 8 years, attached to operations in 3 different countries, and then stopped appearing. The way a name stops appearing in those documents isn't like retirement, it's more like evaporation. What they were able to piece together, and I want to stress that this remained incomplete, that it was a reconstruction built from fragments and inference and the patient, methodical work of an analyst who refused to let an anomaly stay anomalous, was something like this. The man had been operating in that corridor for an extended period, months, possibly longer, not against coalition forces, against a network that used the corridor for movement that the coalition had been unable to disrupt through conventional means. He had been, in essence, doing what the patrol had been sent to do: reconnaissance on, identifying the network, mapping the movement, disrupting it. The patrol's arrival in his operating area had created a problem, not because he was hostile, but because a SEAL team moving through that corridor looking for the same network would, in all likelihood, disrupt the careful, patient work of someone who had spent months building the kind of invisible presence that the ridge position represented. So he'd fired once. had put a round through the shoulder of a man who was about to walk into a structure that, if the intelligence Prentice eventually assembled was accurate, contained an active and occupied hide belonging to someone inside the network. A structure that, if the SEALs had entered and found what was inside, would have collapsed months of careful work in a morning. He hadn't wanted to kill anyone, he'd wanted them to stop. And it had worked. Marcus heard this, or a version of this, because Prentice was careful about what she said and more careful about what she gave him access to about 6 weeks after the patrol. He sat with it for a long time before he said anything. Then he said he could have just communicated through the right channels, sent a warning, something. Prentice gave him a look that was not unkind. And if the right channels were compromised, if someone inside the information chain was part of the network. Marcus was quiet again. He didn't know who he could trust, she said, so he used the one language he was certain couldn't be intercepted. A bullet. A carefully placed bullet, she said, in a non-lethal location, from a prepared position that told anyone who found it exactly how long he'd been watching and how capable he was. It wasn't just a warning shot, it was a full sentence. Marcus looked at her. What did it say? I've been here longer than you, I know this ground better than you, I know what's in that building and you don't. Stop. Garrett recovered. It took longer than the initial optimism suggested. There was nerve involvement that nobody had caught in the field, and there were months of physical therapy, and the shoulder was never quite what it had been before. He didn't complain about it, at least not to anyone who reported it back. He went back to operational status eventually, a different assignment, a different theater. He never met the man who shot him, never had any direct communication with him as far as anyone knew. But there was one thing, and this is the detail that stays with me, the one that doesn't let go the way most details eventually do. About 4 months after the incident, an envelope arrived at the fob addressed to the unit's senior NCO, no return address, postmarked from a city that would have taken considerable logistics to post from given where the patrol had been operating. Inside the envelope was a single photograph. The photograph showed the interior of the structure, the third one, the partially collapsed one, the one Garrett had been moving toward when he was hit. Inside the structure in the photograph you could see 3 men. They were not coalition personnel. They were seated facing each other around what appeared to be an equipment spread, communications gear mostly, the kind used for coordinating movement. The photograph was dated. The timestamp in the corner placed it 18 days after the patrol. The network was still using the location. The work had continued. There was no note, no explanation, nothing else in the envelope. Just the photograph. And a very small detail that Reyes noticed when he was looking at it. He was always the one who noticed small things. It was what made him good at his job. In the corner of the image, barely visible, cut off at the edge of the frame. A boot, just the toe of it. The photographer had been inside the structure when he took the picture. He'd been that close? He'd been inside the same building as the network, close enough to photograph them from the interior, operating with an invisibility that went beyond training and into something else. Something that maybe doesn't have a clean name. Reyes looked at the photograph for a long time. He was right there, he said. The whole time we were on the ridge trying to figure out where he went, he was somewhere entirely different. Nobody responded to that immediately. It had a quality to it that ended conversation the way certain facts do when the full weight of them lands. I don't have a neat ending for this story. I'm not sure there is one. The man was never officially identified. The program he worked for, if it existed the way Prentice believed it did, remained unacknowledged. The firing position on the ridge was photographed, documented, added to an intelligence file, and eventually that intelligence file joined thousands of other intelligence files in a system that processes and stores and rarely resolves. What I do have is this. Somewhere in that desert, or in a different desert, or in a mountain corridor, or on a street that looks ordinary from any angle, there are people operating so far outside the normal geometry of conflict that most of the structures we use to understand that conflict simply don't apply to them. They are not on our side in any straightforward sense. They are not against us. They exist in the specific complicated space between those categories, doing things that serve long purposes that nobody in a single patrol, in a single morning with a single intelligence briefing, could possibly understand. Marcus used to say, and I think about this more than I expected to when he first said it, that the most dangerous assumption you can make in the field is that you're the most prepared person in the area. Someone has always been there longer, he'd say. Always, and if you haven't met them yet, it's because they decided you weren't worth meeting. The East Ridge, the empty cleft, the shoulder wound, the photograph with the boot in the corner. A ghost in the dunes who knew how to vanish before you finished looking. One shot, one message. I was here before you, I'll be here after you leave. And the desert, patient, indifferent, keeping its own counsel across all of it, just kept breathing. The way it always does. The way it always will.